Are we being real with our faith? Are we being real with our faith? That's what I'd like to consider today. And I'd like to start by taking a look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, beginning with verse 3. 2 Timothy 1, verse 3. And we'll read through verse 7. I thank Yahweh, whom I serve with a clear conscience, the way my forefathers did. As I constantly remember you in my prayers night and day, longing to see you, even as I recall your tears, so that I may be filled with joy. For I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm sure that it is in you as well. For this reason, I remind you to kindle afresh the gift of Yahweh, which is in you, through the laying on of my hands. For Yahweh has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. How is your walk with Yahweh today? How does it match up with your actions? Are what you say and what you do consistent? In other words, do you walk the talk? Are you living what you say you believe? Are you convinced that what you say and what you believe in is truly what you believe? In this message today, I'd like to use a portion, not of Timothy, it's just giving you a sense of the expectations that Paul had of his protege, Timothy. But I'd like to use a portion of the Epistle of James to examine the idea of living a faith that is genuine and real. James, who was, of course, the brother of Yahshua and identified himself as a servant of the Most High, a doulos, a slave servant, which Paul also did in many number of his epistles. In James' epistle, I want to use that idea of living a faith that is genuine and real, because that epistle is meant to urge you to consider these questions that I'm asking you and related questions. And of course, it was specifically directed, this letter of James, specifically directed to the audience of James's day, but it is equally applicable in our day, because we encounter the same types of doubts, the same types of fears, the same types of apprehensions as those of his day. Undoubtedly, the times in which they found themselves were difficult, and we know that because of the record of the things that occurred during the first century. And as a matter of fact, we know historically that James himself ultimately was, tradition says that, and there are writings to this effect, that James was ultimately chased to the pinnacle of the temple and that he was thrown off and beaten by his persecutors, and he died that way as a martyr. Along with many in his day were facing persecution. The times in which they found themselves obviously were difficult. And remember that the epistle is directed, because we studied the book of James a while back, you might recall, it's been a while. But the epistle is directed to our brothers and sisters in the diaspora at that time, by definition implying that people were spread out and they were away from one another. They were away from the geographic location in the Holy Land that was generally considered as safest for the day in the mind of a religious Jew anyway. And apparently they, as we do in our day, struggle with living their faith, especially in the midst of persecution. We don't have to go through physical persecution, but you can see how easily that could happen if you look at what's happening today with the Jewish people because of all this foolishness going on in the Middle East and how it's spread throughout the world, and that anti-Jew hatred. You could see that it's very easy for that kind of thing to get going. And we, as worshipers of Yahshua, have not had to experience that, but there have been many Christians throughout the world who have, in fact, suffered persecution. As a matter of fact, I would dare say that Christianity is the most persecuted religion, if you will, throughout the world. And the Jews are in a category by themselves, right? They've been the most persecuted, in my opinion, the most persecuted people in history, people in general. that there's been persecution of other faiths as well, but we haven't had to experience that, at least not yet, not except in more, perhaps more subtle ways. So they found it challenging in their day to achieve a consistency between the words that they heard and the words that they spoke and the lives that they led. In short, they would have found it very challenging, more than likely, to live a genuine faith, a faith that's real. And what about us, especially when we don't have to worry about whether we're going to be taken down in a physical sense for our faith? What about us? Do we remain faithful? Do we remain real with regard to our faith? And that's the title of the message today. Are we being real with our faith? Are we being real with our faith? And this is a good time of year to remember that as we consider Yahweh and his Torah and the spirit that was given. Are we being genuine with him? Are we being real? With today's message, I would like to get us thinking about our faith, and I would like to challenge each of us to do so with a different mindset. If we've not been doing so until this point, I would suggest that we need to take greater care to examine our lives to see if we're living what we say we believe. And I can't answer that for you, and you can't answer that for me. It's a very personal thing, right? It's a matter of personal responsibility. In fact, this is what you'll see what James emphasizes in the segment of scriptures that we'll be looking at today in chapter 1. We each have a responsibility before our Creator to take a close look in the mirror. We want to determine if we're living a faith, again, that is real and that is consistent with our stated intent. The world is short on heroes, brothers and sisters. I don't think I have to tell you that. Can we be lights in the midst of a world that so often seems spiritually dark as people gravitate toward a more secular mindset? Can we be different? Can we be lights in the midst of that world? The world is so very much in need of lights. And it seems every time they turn around, they find more scandal, more darkness, more selfishness instead of selflessness, etc. Can we be the salt of the earth as our master had high hopes for us? Can we spiritually thrive, although it may be challenging and not an easy walk? Because although we're not being persecuted in a physical sense, there are other types of persecution. It's very difficult to live a life that is straight and narrow in accordance with the sacred scriptures. It's very difficult to maintain that kind of a mindset when you live in a world that is so saturated with selfishness and greed and all the kinds of things that fly in the face of a holy and moral life. Just taking the situation with sexual immorality in this world, it seems that this world is saturated, soaked in sexual immorality. It's so incredibly difficult for men in our day to navigate that, in particular, men in particular, because just of the way that men are wired. It happens with women too, increasingly, quite frankly. So it's not unique to men by any stretch, but it's just a fact that men are wired differently. They tend to get the brunt of that. And that's just one example. And by the way, if you poll Christian churches, you're going to find that probably over 50% of pastors are involved in things like pornography and other types of sexual immorality. No one is spared from that, brothers and sisters. That's why I say knowledge is not power. Knowledge applied is power, right? That's wisdom. Knowledge applied is wisdom. Wisdom is the beginning of the fear of Yahweh. And we have to apply constant daily wisdom in order to make sure that we stay on the straight and narrow. And that's not just with regard to sexual matters, but it's anything having to do with holiness and keeping on the straight and narrow in accordance with the ways of Yahweh, what the scriptures refer to as sanctification. It's got to be a daily thing. It's interesting that if you recall something like Deuteronomy 17, when the king was being given, and of course there was no king at the time that was written, but it was looking forward into the future when they would have a king. And the idea was that the king has to write a book of the law for himself. And then he has to read in it every single day. Why? Because he has to remind himself every single day of what is necessary in order for him to maintain himself as a good ruler and as a good person, right? It's what he carries forward, not just to the king, but to any of us in places like Psalm 1, where we're told to meditate on Yahweh's word day and night. And by the way, that terminology of meditate I learned recently, and I didn't know this, that the word has a connotation of mumbling to yourself, or like reading to yourself. When you're reading a book and you do what they tell you never to do when you're reading, right? When you're reading, tell me who you want to be under the Lord. It's that kind of thing. It's a soft, open meditation where you're speaking the words out loud to remind yourself of what those things are. And you're doing that every single day. We need to do that if we're going to spiritually thrive. We have to be in his word often, always. Although we don't have that kind of persecution that some have experienced in the course of history, we still struggle, and it's not a challenging or easy walk. We need people like you, people who know Yahweh, who know Yahshua, who are dedicated to his word, who can show others how it's done. Will you rise to the challenge and join Yahshua to proclaim the good news of Yahweh's reign on this earth? We're doing that as advanced troops. We're ambassadors of that kingdom. Can we be effective ambassadors? The only way we could do that is if our faith is real, and if that comes out in the way in which we live and not just in what we say. James offers us several points that are food for thought, and that will help us to frame that in our mind. But before we examine these simple lessons on living a genuine faith, I'd like to take a closer look at the term that James refers to in part of his letter, which is so important, and that is the term religion. In chapter 1, verse 26, he says, if anyone thinks himself to be religious, and a lot of people pride themselves on being religious, and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. Pure and then he gives us what he views as being the true definition of religion. So he's talking about a religion where people say that they believe, right? And he uses the model example of how they act just with what they speak. I'm not even talking about even going to the extent of their actions, but just the way they speak, they deceive themselves. And he says that that person who has the inconsistency, that incongruence between what they say they believe and the way that they actually speak about others or the way they treat others, that person is deceiving themselves, and that person's religion is worthless. Why? Because verse 27, pure and undefiled religion, true religion in the sight of our Elohim and Father is this. And then he explains what it is. What is it? It's to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. There it all is. To treat others according to the golden rule, right? It's Isaiah 58 type of stuff. You remember Isaiah 58, where it talks about people who were fasting on the Day of Atonement, and yet they were ignoring the poor, they were ignoring the hungry, they were ignoring the destitute, they were ignoring the naked, they were ignoring the afflicted, the poor of the earth, the orphan and the widow, etc. Pure religion, James says, is to look after those people. A little bit later today, Yahweh willing, we'll look deeper into our study of Ephesians. And in Ephesians 2:10, he talks about the works that Yahweh previously prepared for us to do. But though those works are not referring to the elements of the law, as you would see in the Ten Commandments and in the commandments that are described in the covenant, at least not per se. Those works are referring to, it is encompassed in it, but it's talking more specifically about the works that you would see, that's saying in Galatians 5, where it talks about the fruit of the Spirit, the love and the compassion and looking out, the kind of things Isaiah 58 described and what James is describing here, where you're actually going out and doing works to demonstrate your faith. That's pure religion. And at the same time, to keep oneself unstained by the world. In other words, not mixing in a world that is dead, a world that its days are numbered. Do we realize that? Do we realize that this current system of things is coming to an end? That's what we're told in 1 John and other places. This world is coming to an end, not the world itself. We're not talking about the world. There are several different words in the New Testament that describe the term world, and they don't all mean the same thing. So the world that I'm referring to is the cosmos, is this worldly system of things. It's coming to a close, and it's going to be replaced with new creation. So we're supposed to keep ourselves unstained, uninvolved with this present system as something that is, its days are numbered and is coming to an end. So pure religion is doing that, is keeping yourself unstained from this worldly system and instead acting in ways that show your allegiance to and your anticipation of the new system, of the new creation that Yahweh is presenting, in which the underdog is going to be taken care of, in which the poor will be fed, all the things in the Sermon on the Mount, in which the poor will be fed and the mourners will be happy once again, and on we could go. That's religion. The Greek in James implies ceremonial observance and worship and comes from a word having to do with piety and supplication. Consider some of the interesting definitions that the dictionary offers about the origins of the word religion. So it's a word from Middle English, from Anglo-French, religion, and Latin, religion, religio. It has to do with supernatural constraint or sanction, and by extension, religious practice, perhaps coming from a word that means to restrain, to tie back. In other words, you're putting a boundary, setting a boundary for yourself. And another source talks about that word having a connotation of conscientiousness, piety, and that other term, to tie, to fasten. You might know the Latin word ligare means to bind, and there's words I could point to in Spanish and in English that would give you a better sense of that, to bind or to tie. So the term religion then seems to imply a force of restraint in some way. A force of restraint. In what sense would there be restraint? Perhaps in the sense that morality, and more specifically the morality of Yahweh, the ways of Yahweh, restrains us from doing the wrong thing. And of course, it has a supernatural basis. In other words, it's from a supernatural creator who created a system to keep the boundaries there. He even describes that in, not in the sense of religion, but just in the sense of order. When the word describes the creation, it says that Yahweh, he set the seas with their boundaries so that they would go this far, but no further. So that exists for things that are not even alive in the sense in which we know it, sentient, things that are not sentient. That all those things know their place. The animals instinctively know their place. They don't have a sense of morality like we do. The dog doesn't care if it goes and eats its own vomit, right? Okay. Or the lion doesn't care if he goes and tears apart the hyena. He doesn't think, was the hyena a nice guy? He doesn't think that, right? Does the hyena have a family, right? Does the hyena have little ones that depends on him? They don't think that. We do. We have that sense of morality. And then the word also implies binding, fastening. As you might consider the words of the Shema, the word of Yahweh is meant to be fastened on our foreheads and our arms, not in a literal sense, but in a spiritual, figurative, metaphorical sense. In other words, it's meant to be with us at all times. And that binding together may also have an implication in our case with the binding together of our hearts with Yahweh and with one another, as is fitting for the body of Messiah. Sadly, though, in our day, the term religion tends to have a bad name because it's so misused, because people tend to associate it with a religious system and not in the sense that I'm explaining to you today. Just a reminder, what does James have to say about genuine religion? What is genuine faith, real faith, if you will, as I've been asking the question if our faith is real? What does real faith look based on this passage? I'd like to suggest 5 main points to consider that I see here in this passage. 5 main points that tell us something about faith that is genuine. So you might consider these 5 guidelines on living your faith in a genuine way. So the first one would be this, and it's taken from James 1, verses 16 and 17. So let's go there first. So James says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow." So notice, every good thing given, every perfect gift is from above. And where does it come from? Where does every good thing, every good gift, every good thing given, where does it come from? It comes from above, and understand that above is not necessarily up and down, but it's that cross-dimensional thing that I discussed in the past. But it comes from Yahweh, from that source who is the father of lights, he's called. He's referred to as the father of lights by James because there is no darkness in him. So it comes down from the father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. So what does that mean? It means that Yahweh doesn't change. It means that Yahweh is the same now as he has always been. So just as a quick cross-reference here, I'll direct you to Philippians chapter 4, where Paul also talks about things that are good. And what does Paul say? He says in chapter 4, in verse 8, Paul says, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, these are good things, right? Whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute. In other words, these people speak well of it. If there's any excellence, and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. That's what we're supposed to be dwelling on. Remember that he said elsewhere in 2 Corinthians, he spoke about how we're taking our thoughts, our every thought captive. Everything that is contrary to the word of Yahweh, we're subordinating it, we're subjecting it to Yahweh himself in submission to him. We're taking away those things, we're clearing our minds of those things that do not profit, right? And instead, we're thinking of these things. Verse 9, the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, Paul says, practice these things, and the Elohim of peace will be with you. In other words, that will be the consequence of you practicing those things, that you're thinking constantly on what's true, on whatever's honorable, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's of good repute. It's hard to do that in a world like this, brothers and sisters. I don't have to tell you, it's hard to do that. There's a lot of negativity out there. I've made a very concerted effort over the last year to greatly scale back my consumption of various types of media, not just social media, certainly social media, especially something like Twitter, which is a cesspool. I still use it to keep track of things in the world, but I don't nearly use it as much. And I time my use of it very carefully because I used to doom scroll, the term doom scrolling, right? We just scroll through a thing, all these doom after doom. It's very easy to do that. And in short order, all you're thinking is that everything is wrong with the world, and everything is not. The people who use those things, like Twitter and others, they're probably, comparatively speaking, a very small percentage of the population. So you tend to start thinking, because the one with the biggest megaphone gets the biggest voice, so you tend to think that the entire world is like that, and it's not. People don't think like that throughout the world. They're influenced by it, but not everyone thinks like that. Not everyone accepts those kind of things. If you're in the habit of doom scrolling all the time, it's going to have an effect on you. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you're aware, but there is a movement that has intensified. It's always been there in the background, but it's become more intense in recent months. A movement to encourage schools and parents to remove cell phones from children, or to seriously curtail the use of cell phones, at least when they're studying, or at least when they're in school, or for parents to limit the use of those things, because there's such a mental health crisis. We're all hearing about the mental health crisis. Where does that come from? In part because of that, because of all the comparison and the doom that you're seeing all the time, and the way kids tend at the early ages to compare themselves to other people, and all the phoniness and disingenuousness that you see in posts of various types, whatever the platform is. So if you're constantly filling your mind with that sort of thing, and then don't stop there, right? I'm a consumer, a great consumer of media. I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I watch movies, I watch TV, okay? I don't do it incessantly. I don't watch junk all the time. Okay? Your opinion, right? You might think that the stuff I watch is junk, and I might think that some of the stuff you watch is junk, okay? I'm not a big reality TV guy, for example. You may love it. To me, I can't waste a minute with so-called reality TV, because to me, it's the furthest thing from reality. But that's me. You might think it's a great source of diversion and entertainment. Movies, right? I watch movies all the time, right? And movies are not always the best thing. It all depends. So we may have different opinions of how we consider one thing as compared to another, okay? So even things that might be good, that you might consider to be good quality, you might want to limit some of that too, because even great movies could be keeping you in a fantasy world where you're not getting things done in the quote unquote real world, right? So we have to be careful about things like this. We have to be careful about what we put into our minds. And Paul encourages us, and James appears to back that up, Paul encourages us to fill our minds with things that are pure and honorable and right and just and things of good repute, because those things are going to keep us alive. Those things are going to keep us hopeful. I'm not suggesting that you walk around in a Pollyannish attitude, right? You all know that term Pollyanna, it's in reference to an old movie where the girl saw no wrong with the world. I'm not suggesting that you go around with a fake smile on your face and, oh, yeah, everything's great. And then we all know that everything's not great. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But what I am saying is that you want to fill your mind with things that are going to edify, things that are going to help you to see the best of this world, things that are going to be conducive towards having you move in the direction of new creation, where this earth is going to be restored and the beauty that Yahweh originally intended is going to be brought forth. Not a world of thorns and of thistles. That wasn't the intention, but a world of abundance and of fruition. So James says, every good thing given in every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, and he doesn't change, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. So the first thing I just want to remind you is that genuine faith, real faith, acknowledges the ultimate source of all truth. Who is the source of that truth? It's Yahweh himself. And when we acknowledge that, and when we seek after those things that match that sense of perfection and light, we're going to improve our lives by that much. And we also want to acknowledge that there are many counterfeit truths out there. One of my most hated expressions is live your truth. There are many expressions that are used in the present day that I absolutely despise, that I think that they're just horrible things that people repeat over and over again, and you repeat them enough times and you believe them, right? Because that's what you do. That's what a belief is. It's a thought that's repeated either by someone else or you to yourself over and over again until you think that thing is true. And all of a sudden it becomes a truth to you. It becomes your truth. And it may not be true at all. And I can give you many examples, but I don't want to go there today. But there are many counterfeit truths out there, but they are exactly that. They're not true at all. They're fake and cheap attempts to replicate the real thing. Do not be deceived. Proverbs 16, verse 25 says, there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Sometimes things seem right, but whether because you lack information about it or because you lack wisdom of how to use it, or you don't see the end consequence of that thing, or you don't have enough experience to see that thing through, it seems right, but its end is death. This is why it's important to consult wise counselors. It's important for children to listen to their parents and adults in their lives who've been there, because sometimes something seems right. Sometimes something seems like the good course of action, but someone who's been along that road or has dealt with people who've been down that road and seen the consequences in their lives can clue that person in to the fact that it's not right at all and that its end is only death or destruction. What about 2 Timothy 3, verse 5? And this speaks about people out there who claim to have the truth. And it describes one of the characteristics as holding to a form of righteousness, although they have denied its power. So we're talking about the source. Where's the true source? Where does the real faith come from? It comes from a reliable source who doesn't change, who doesn't shift with the winds. And there are some out there who hold to a form of righteousness. It looks right, like what Proverbs 16:25 is referring to. It looks right, but as you probe and go deeper, it's not right. It maybe has a form, the veneer, right? It's a house of cards, maybe. And if you push it just a little bit, it falls apart. Although they have denied its power, that's one of the clues that you know that it's not real. Because when people are claiming righteousness and truth, and yet they deny the main source in this world of righteousness and truth, which is the Creator himself, automatically becomes suspect. Now, people may have a form of that because they may be willing to accept certain parts of that, but not the whole thing, not from the source. It's something you have to be careful of. In fact, Paul says to Timothy, avoid such men as these. You want to be careful. And this is an extreme example, right? He's not talking about people who are just ignorant or don't know or whatever. He's talking about people who are presenting themselves as the end all be all. In other words, many hold to a form of righteousness but denies power, means that they want to claim those promises, but they want to deny from whom they came. But you have to be careful of that. Where does the actual truth comes from? What is it that makes you adequate in this world? Just read on a few verses. Over at verses 16 to 17, very famous passage, all scripture, and it's referring to essentially the Bible, right? All scripture is inspired by Yahweh and profitable for what? For teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of Elohim may be adequate, equipped for every good work. And there's that terminology, good work again, which is comparable to what in Ephesians 2:10. In other words, how you're going to be in this world with people, with your fellow man, right? How are you going to be with them? The scriptures has everything we need to know in order to know how to live by faith. It's complete and profitable for teaching, right? In other words, so that you can learn something new about how the world works and what his will is for your life and for the life of humankind. For reproof, sometimes we have to be turned from something. Correction, the explanation of how you can be turned from that thing so that you don't keep going in a direction that's going to lead to destruction. And training in righteousness, the specific training that you get day by day, week by week, Sabbath by Sabbath, feast day by feast day, in order to learn how to live in accordance with the ways of Yahweh, right? So as long as we recognize the source from which that comes from, we will be at a good starting point to have a faith that is real, a faith that is genuine. The second thing is that a real faith or a genuine faith is steady, stable, unchanging. So you recognize the source where it comes from, but it's also steady as it goes, stable, unchanging, like Yahweh, right? That's what James said. He said that Yahweh doesn't change. He's referred to as the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. That's one of the things that I appreciate about Yahweh, is that his ways are constant, they're consistent. There are things in this world, I'm going to be just blunt, right? This is in my opinion. You may have a different opinion, but in my opinion, there are things in this world that are more exciting than doing the right thing all the time. If you're being honest, if you're being genuine, you may be afraid to say that or to think that or to say the quiet part out loud, but I'll say it, right? This is a very trivial example in comparison, but I'm just going to give it to you. I don't not eat things like pork and crab and all those things because I walk around saying, oh, those things taste terrible. No, if you've had them, they taste pretty darn good, okay? I don't eat them because, and they smell good, right? They're very inviting, but that's the whole point. These kinds of things are very inviting. As I said, big picture, that's a trivial example because you really don't look at a whole moral issue if you grab a piece of pernil, grab a piece of pork, right? Of roast pork, but it's really good. And anyone who hasn't had it, for them to go around saying that's terrible. No, you haven't had it. I'm sorry. So why don't we eat it? I don't eat it because Yahweh's word says don't eat it. And I take it at face value that he knows what he's talking about more so than me. And I don't look for hygienic reasons. To me, all those things are a byproduct. For me, it's simply because he said don't do it. And if he said that we're supposed to have childlike faith, what does that mean to have childlike faith? It means that we don't go around questioning everything. It means children trust their parents. There is an inherent implicit trust and an implicit loyalty. And until they reach a certain age, they are very accepting of what their parents say to them, and they just go and they do it, right? Now, that goes within reason, right? Kids are always going to prod and they're going to test. So I'm not talking about the normal day-to-day development of a child, but I'm talking about the mindset of a child to trust their parents until they start really questioning a bunch of things at a certain age. That child, small child, has that sense of trust in their parent. And that's what I believe we also must have, that sense of trust in the one who is unchanging, so that we can also remain unchanging. Because although there are many more exciting things that we can be doing and that we can be engaging in, okay, so piece of pork may not be best example, right? What about sleeping around? Okay, I can guarantee you that sleeping around would be pleasurable, right? I don't have to tiptoe around that. We all know that. But is that going to be something that is going to benefit us? Absolutely not, right? There is value to committing to one person to whom you're going to devote your life and you're going to look after one another. And there are ethical considerations and legal considerations and every other thing. But to walk around denying that there would be pleasure in that, that's just foolish, in my opinion. I think we have to acknowledge the reality of something like that and then say, precisely because we could go astray, we have to be especially careful. And we have to look at everything that's pure and good and righteous and just, because we know that Yahweh has presented that system to us as one that is going to be bountiful and that's going to lead to life. And we all have seen the evidence around us of the people who follow in the other direction and where it goes. And you know what? Oh, there'll always be someone who comes up with an exception. And I've been doing this for 20 years, 30 years. You know what? More power to you, kid. But from my opinion, most of the misery and the decadent life that people lead and the way in which people go, there's way too much evidence to prove that those ways do not lead to genuine happiness. So I don't care how many exceptions you want to bring up. The vast majority are going to show evidence to the contrary. Genuine faith is steady, it's stable, it's unchanging. Are we Sabbath-only believers? Are we feast day-only worshipers? James said that with Yahweh, there's no variation or shifting shadow. Malachi 3, verse 6 says something similar, right? For I, Yahweh, do not change. Therefore, you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. If he changed, he would forget his mercy and his compassion, and the sons of Jacob would have been mincemeat. He's stable, and therefore we can be stable if we lean on him. And that's something that I think many people crave today. I think a lot of people are seeing the lack of value in excitement and spontaneity, and they would appreciate a little bit of stability in the present day. There's way too much instability out there, and we call it by other names, and then we romanticize those things, but yet the steady tend to be the things that lead to the long-term fulfillment. Matthew 7, verse 24, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, Yahshua says, and acts on them, not just hears them, but acts on them, may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, because the storms are going to come, right? And the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. It's almost a certainty. So we have to build our house, my friends, on the rock. We have to build our house on something that is stable. Number 3, genuine or real faith emphasizes the will of Yahweh above the will of the self. And that's what I was alluding to before when I said that we can go in those other directions. We have the free will to do that. But the question is, do we want to go in a direction because there's evidence all around us that we know is not going to lead to ultimate fulfillment and satisfaction? Sometimes the boring is the best, my friends. I just got to say it. Sometimes it's a little boredom goes a long way for ultimate fulfillment. Genuine faith emphasizes the will of Yahweh above the will of the self. Continuing in James chapter 1, beginning with verse 18, this is what he says. In the exercise of his will, Yahweh, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. Tomorrow, or beginning tonight, we celebrate the feast that describes the first fruits. And we want to be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. We're an initial crop, if you will, of the new creation, right? This, verse 19, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of Yahweh. And therefore, putting aside all filthiness and all that remains of wickedness, in humility, receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. So it's Yahweh's will that brought us here, not our own. Based on this passage, it's Yahweh's will that we should be a kind of first fruits, right? In other words, if we're the first fruits, then we're serving as an example for others. It's Yahweh's will that we listen rather than speak. Right? There's an old saying that there's a reason why we have two ears and one mouth, right? We should be listening before we speak, or listening more than we speak. I've been in the business world a long time, more accurately in the world of government. Same business, just a different angle. And I can tell you that the value that is placed on when you're doing any kind of a course on interpersonal skills, any kind of course on networking, any kind of course of holding meetings, all those kind of things, there's always an emphasis on what? On listening. They literally teach good listening skills. And people say, oh, that's obvious. But you know what? The obvious is not always so obvious. Common sense, you'd be surprised how uncommon it really is. And people need to learn how to listen rather than speak. Too many people want to run their mouths before they've heard. Even the scriptures acknowledge that, right? In Proverbs, it says the person, I'm paraphrasing, it says the person who speaks before he listens is a fool. Because the person who speaks before they listen doesn't have all the facts. And they're not trying to get all the facts and get all the nuance before they go ahead and propose something. Listen, cultivate that skill. Yahweh's will is that we do these things, that we're first fruits, that we be an example for others, that we listen rather than speak, and that we recognize that we cannot impose our will over his. That's where he says his righteousness is what's going to effectuate things, not our anger. Verse 20, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of Elohim. Boy, have I learned that from multiple experiences, thinking that my pushing things, whether it's in my family, with my wife, or with my children, or at work, or with something in the congregation, thinking that if I just raise my voice enough, or if I use enough words, or if I use enough pressure or influence, that things are going to work the way that they should. And sometimes it's just time to shut up and listen and let Yahweh's will be done. Because sometimes you think that you know best, and the truth of the matter is that ultimately Yahweh knows best because he sees the end from the beginning. Understand, in other words, that ultimately our service to Yahweh and our relationship with him and with others is about submission and all humility. That's a primary theme of Ephesians, right? That's in Ephesians 5. We won't get to Ephesians 5 for a while, but when we get to it, you're going to see that whole Ephesians 5, where it talks about the relationship between husband and wife, and between parents and children, and slave and master, the key to all of that is submission to one another, right? That people totally messed that up. Years, centuries really of misinterpretation have poisoned people against something like Ephesians 5, especially with the whole husband and wife thing. But ultimately what that's talking about is submission to one another. All of those parties, if those relationships are going to work. And that's how it is in general with our relationship with the two greatest elements in our lives with relationships: the vertical, our relationship with Yahweh, and the horizontal, our relationship with our neighbor. It's about submission in all humility. I also want to take a quick look at Proverbs 3, verse 7. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear Yahweh and turn away from evil. We have a tendency sometimes to be wise in our own eyes. And that's something that we need to watch out for. Remember Moses and the rock. Moses thought he was wiser than Yahweh in that instance, and he wasn't. He just let his anger get the better of him. Jacob and his deception with his father, this jumping the gun that he did, that blessing was for him, but I'm sure he put himself through a lot more misery than needed to be because he jumped the gun and he didn't let Yahweh do things in his time. What about us? It's easy to point the finger at people who've been long dead, at Moses or at Jacob, and say, wow, how come they didn't trust in Yahweh? It's like I was in conversation recently with someone who went down that road. And I don't know why the Israelites this and why they've seen all these plagues and everything. If I had been there, well, yeah. As soon as I hear someone say, if I had it, my mind is already shut off. To me, that's just a person that is being foolish in the way that they're talking. Because we've all been that Israelite. We've all been that person. If you look back in your life and you think how Yahweh has taken you out of more gems than one, you know how many times that Yahweh spared you. There's a passage in scripture that, and you have to look at that with humility and thank Yahweh. There's a passage where Paul, I think it was Paul, that said something about how one of the people who had been ministering to him, that he almost died, and that Yahweh spared him from that sorrow. by lifting him up from that bed of affliction. I know exactly how that feels. Just recently, and maybe you can get the story at the Feast of Tabernacles, my wife, I could have lost her. I'm talking about like 2 weeks ago, right? Driving, she was in a situation where she was in a pouring torrents of rain on the highway, and some pickup went into her lane. Probably didn't even see her, went into her lane, and if she hadn't had a shoulder, I would have gotten a phone call that night where I was waiting for her. And I imagine that phone call, me losing my wife like that. And it could have happened in an instant. And how many instances have we had that in our lives where we passed a certain thing, or the proverbial going past the train tracks and then realizing after the train goes by that you could have been there a second before? How many experiences like that have we had? And how many have we gone through that we don't know about? Those are the ones I think that if I sat around thinking about, I would be more paranoid, right? It's like, how many things did I not know about that, I know that my sons have probably been through things that they've never told me about because they know that I tend to be a worrywart, right? Especially with my one son who has a profession where he's perpetually in danger, right? I'm sure that I don't know the half of stuff that he went through, and that's A-okay with me, right? And my other son has told me about instances in snow and other things, but this is life, right? We don't know. We don't know what's around the corner, and we don't have control over everything over which we think we have control. So trusting Yahweh and his will seems like the best option for us. And if we can do that, if we can trust in his will and emphasize his will above our own self-will, which is so very limited, I think that our lives would be that much richer for it. Number 4, we're looking at 5, so we just have a couple more. Genuine or real faith emphasizes personal responsibility. And I think we've been seeing that in everything we've been reading. But let's read, continuing James 1, 22 to 27 for these last few sections here. James 1, 22. But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves. Remember that wisdom, true wisdom, is the word, knowledge put into practice. Does you no good if you just hear it, right? It's interesting that when Yahshua talked about the person who was building on a foundation, it says, how did he put that? Trying to remember what the passage was. Matthew 7:24. I hadn't even noticed that when I originally prepared for this session. Matthew 7:24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them, right? It's not enough just to hear those things, but you got to act on those things as well. So he says back in James 1:22, but prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. How many people have you heard that say, I know about this, that, or the other thing? I know I should exercise more. And yet the evidence speaks for itself, right? I know I should eat better. I know I shouldn't be eating that garbage at 9 o'clock at night. I know I shouldn't be doing that, right? And if I hear that one more time from my wife, no, let me stop. But that's the thing. We do it all the time. We've all had the experience going to somebody and offering sometimes unsolicited advice, but sometimes it's even solicited. That makes it even especially egregious. When someone practically begs you for your counsel and you go and you give it to them, and they, oh yeah, I've already done that. I know, I have done that 100 times. I've done everything. And yet when you look at the evidence, they've done nothing. Or they keep doing the same ridiculous, ineffectual thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's how we are as human beings. That's human nature. For if anyone, verse 23, is a hearer, it's delusion, right? They delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. It's a good start. It's a good start. You go and you look at yourself in the mirror, but then if you see your hair all out of place, or you see your face dirty or whatever, and you walk away, you don't do anything about it. You don't comb that hair. You don't wash the face. That says something about your character. It says that you're seeing something, you're willing to go part way, but you're not willing to take it all the way. And there are reasons behind that. That's like a coach's gold mine, right? Why are you doing that? We do it, all of us. And why do we do that? Why do we go for that second piece of whatever when we know that was going to give us heartburn that night? Why do we do it? Is it because we're arrogant? Is it because we believe the odds don't apply to us? That's the person who goes and is speeding all the time and says, I've been doing this for 10 years and I get away with it all the time. You know what, my friends? All it takes is the one time that you're caught. Or all it takes is the one time that you miscalculate. Yeah, maybe you've been going 10 years and you're going over the speed limit by 30 miles per hour. No problem. You're very skillful. Congratulations. I hope you're proud of yourself. And then the one time that someone else makes a mistake at the same time that you're deliberately doing what you've been doing for 10 years and you've gotten away with it, but that one time someone gets in the way and you wind up having a serious crash and it changes your life forever. All it takes is the one time. Are we willing to do those things? Or do we make the corrections ahead of time? For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he's immediately forgotten what kind of person he was, and he didn't do anything apparently. But the contrast, one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, notice that it's the law that gives you liberty, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, because it's very easy to forget just by listening, because the words just become a wisp in the wind. But if you go and you put it into practice, let me tell you how a lot of what reaches you from the Bible, how it comes to you. Let me tell you my process, right? There's no mystery, there's no mystical, right? There's no special, wonderful discipline that I have. Here's what happens. I get up in the morning, I listen to somebody, N.T. Wright or Tim Mackey or some other person, and then you know what I do? Then I go, I listen to it again, I take my own notes, I add stuff to it, and then I serve it to you on a plate. It doesn't come from nowhere. I don't make it all up. Some things I make up, not make up. I do my own research. I just specify that. But the way I do it is I listen to other people or I read other people. And the best way for me, and you hear this all the time, it sounds cliche, but I promise you it's true, that the best way to learn something is to teach it to somebody else. I remember classes where the instructor would invariably say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a commitment today that you're going to leave here this session, and within a day, you're going to go and you're going to teach it to somebody else. I've heard that many times over the course of my career because it's true, because it becomes real to you. And this is no different. The one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, goes and does the thing, not having to become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer. Do this thing. This man will be blessed in what he does. It's true. I've experienced it over and over again. I promise you it's true. And then he talks about what we read before about religious, right? You think yourself religious, but you're not acting religious or speaking in a religious way. It doesn't mean anything. But if you're doing it, if you're helping the poor, it's Isaiah 58 stuff, if you're speaking the truth with your neighbor, if you're taking care of the orphan and the widow and on, then the sun will rise and everything else that describes there in Isaiah 58, right? Also over in Philippians 2, as I start to draw this to a close here. Philippians 2, verse 12. For so then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, not just when I'm here, not just when I can see you, but how much more in my absence. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Work it out with fear and trembling. Do the things that you need to, and not because I'm looking at you, but because it's the right thing to do, and because you know that it's Yahweh's will. For it is Yahweh who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Fear and trembling is what in Romans 12, a living sacrifice, where you're actually doing these things and presenting yourself daily before Almighty Yahweh. And knowing what not to do, right? Do not follow the crowd to do evil. That's Exodus 23, 2-3. Don't follow the crowd to do evil. Don't just let this world, the current, take you, right? It requires constant introspection. It's activity. It requires constant introspection and course correction. That's working out your salvation with fear. It has nothing to do with works of the law. It means doing the things that Yahweh has told you to do, doing the things that will keep you sanctified, doing the things that Paul said about thinking about things that are good and that are right and that are just, and that James is speaking about doing the things that are perfect. It requires constant introspection and course correction. Introspection is not something that you do twice a year, just before Passover and just before the Yom Kippur and the Feast of Tabernacles. It's something that you engage in daily so that you can improve yourself. It's like what I was saying earlier in the sermon about the king who reads in the book of the law every day of his life. And the model for this is Exodus 38, which I usually read around Passover time, Exodus 38, verse 8, which is talking about the craftsman who made the laver of bronze. Moreover, he made the laver of bronze with its base of bronze from the mirrors of the serving women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. I've always found that to be a curious thing, the mirror that is used to make the laver. As I've explained, the mirrors that were used, it helps with reflection. So when you look in the water and you're washing yourself in the water, you see yourself. You see your reflection. And do I think that's coincidental that someone like James, who had the knowledge of a priest, he wasn't a priest, but he had the knowledge level of a priest. Do you see, some people think that he wrote the book of Hebrews. I'm not convinced of that, but it's just an interesting aside because he was so devoted and devout and loyal. And for him to be talking about looking at your face in a mirror, it's interesting how there might be a hyperlink there over to Exodus 38, right? Okay, and the last one is that genuine faith requires, and this is an outshoot on what I just said, it requires action, not words. And that's what I just read, 1:27. But let me just read a little bit further into the second chapter of James here. So James chapter 2, verse 1. My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Master Yahshua Messiah with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who's wearing the fine clothes, and you say, you sit here in a good place. And you say to the poor man, you stand over there or sit down by my footstool. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? And he goes on talking about how people have a tendency to play favorites and favor the rich over the poor, or in reverse, right? And he goes on, he explains a couple of other examples. No, you got to treat everyone the same, right? And that action is something that you do, not just hearing stuff, not stuff with your mouth, but actually doing it, caring for the hungry and the poor and the destitute. I mentioned Isaiah 58. It's in my notes. I mentioned it several times. I won't go there, but that's the one that talks about cry aloud, spare not, and tell my people what they're doing wrong, right? Is this the fast I've chosen, that you go and you bow your head and sackcloth and ashes, and that doesn't impress anybody. You want to fast, you want to show the lessons of fasting and of drawing near and being intimate with Yahweh and truly humbling yourself, then you, from a place of your wealth and from your standing, go and show grace to those who don't have what you have and help them, not just from a material point of view, but from your words and your kindness and your presence, right? It doesn't all have to be about money and about things, temporal things. It can just be about your presence somewhere. And then I had in my notes, and I won't turn to it, I have several notes here, Matthew 25, that talks 31 to 40, with the emphasis on the nations, right? You didn't feed me when I was hungry. You didn't clothe me when I was naked. Master, when didn't I clothe you? When I didn't feed you? If you didn't do one of the least of these, you haven't done it unto me. There's actually a prophetic content that I think that passage in Matthew 25 is often misinterpreted because the context is not properly elaborated upon. There are many passages that are like that are attributed to individual situations, and they're not individual situations. They play into the greater story of Israel and the nations. However, these things can also have an application on an individual basis. It's the idea of doing it for one of these little ones, okay? And there are passages on compassion in Micah and Matthew 18, right? Matthew 18 we all know about, with confronting the person with whom you have an issue so that you can achieve reconciliation and peace between you. To conclude, I just want to turn to a passage I've already mentioned, which is Romans 12. And just remind us of the general attitude that we should have if we want to have a faith that's considered to be real. And it really all boils down to this, right? Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, which is the centerpiece of how we're supposed to act. If you want to know a concise summary of how believers should, their credo, what it should be, right? Forget about Apostles' Creed and all that other stuff. Here's your Apostles' Creed right here. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of Yahweh, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to Yahweh, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of Yahweh is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. This is language that is obviously temple language, right? This is priestly language. Paul, this book of Romans, interestingly enough, that was written mainly to Gentiles, Jews as well. It's both, but largely to Gentiles in the Roman world. It's really both. There are things that are really strongly directed towards Jewish people, and there are things that are strongly directed towards Gentiles. But this passage here is like the heart of it. I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of Yahweh, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice. That's your spiritual service of worship. And how do you do that? You do it by having a real faith. And that real faith is characterized by a renewal of your mind, because you're renewing your mind to be new creation. It's what in Ephesians 4, where it talks about putting off the old man and putting on the new man. What is that about? It's about putting off the old creation and putting on the person. In other words, practicing now, living now in a way that shows that you acknowledge Yahweh's new creation. You don't have it all the way yet because you're not dead and resurrected, right? But that's coming. But why wait? We can live that way right now. We can have a faith that is real. And the good news is that it's completely up to you, because if your will is in congruence with Almighty Yahweh, there's nobody or anything that's going to stop you. So may Yahweh bless you, and may He give you peace as you continue to live a faith that is real in the midst of a challenging generation. And I'll tell you something, as you do that, people will take notice. Your family members will take notice. The people around, your neighbors will take notice. And in so doing, you will be giving a witness that is very strong. So you'll not only be preserving your own life, but you will also be serving as a model for others, as light for others, as Yahweh is light, as Yahshua is light, because you also, my friends, are the light of this earth. May Yahweh bless you and help you to continue to serve as a little light in service of the bigger light. So may Yahweh bless you and keep you.